And welcome everyone. Welcome from Together SC. I am Debbie Nelson, and you've seen me on a lot of calls this past year, and I welcome all of you from across the state. I was so delighted to look at the registration list this morning and see all of you that are attending today. And what I love about these meetings that we have, and particularly in this topic around removing our blinders, we have grant makers that are attending, we have nonprofit leaders, we have business partners. So many of our allies are engaged in this work around facing race, and we thank all of you for being here this morning. We have a great program planned, and it's kind of fortuitous that today, March 4th, is literally a year ago. We were sitting, or some of us were sitting in rooms in Columbia at the Marriott with our kickoff of our Facing Race Together. And wow, you know, what a year that has been. But literally a year ago, we were all together in one place, tackling and starting to tackle this important topic of racial equity and social justice. And as we well know, over the last year, it's become more evident that this work is more important than ever. So we have been doing programming at Together SC, and one of the regular programs we do on a monthly basis is removing our blinders, and that's why you're here today. It's been one of our most successful offerings, and the concept behind removing our blinders is that we invite a white leader to share their experiences and their personal journey around racism and white privilege. And what I love so much about this series is that many of the Together SC board members have raised their hand and have been willing and have offered to do this, as we have today. One of our board members, Ann Warner, and I think because we want and we're encouraging our nonprofits across the state to do this work, we are so enthusiastic about how our board members are also really engaged in this work and are willing to be very transparent and open and share their own personal stories. I hope many of you had the opportunity earlier this week to read the letter that Ann wrote to our mail list, which is 6,000 plus of you out there, and sharing her experience of growing up to be nice, as I think all or many of us were raised that way, but how that really isn't the answer when we face these tough issues of race. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from her and her team members. Ann is the CEO of WREN, the Women's Rights Empowerment Network, and is a statewide organization. So many of you may have worked with her on some of her advocacy efforts around access to health and economic well-being and the rights of women, girls, and their families. So I welcome Ann being here today. Thank her for doing this. And she's going to introduce a few of her teammates that will also be sharing some of their experiences at WREN as they've become or are pivoting to become an anti-racist organization, both internally and externally. So with that, I turn it over to Ann. Thanks for being here this morning, Ann.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Can you hear me okay?
You're great.
Launch and okay, great. It's a real pleasure to be with you all, and I've met and worked with many of you, and some of you are new faces, and I wish we were all together in person, but I will take this as a great way to have an important conversation. My name again is Ann Warner. My pronouns are she and her. And I am really proud to be a Together SC board member, as well as the CEO of WREN, the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network. And I am joined today by some of my colleagues, and I'm going to bring them into this conversation and hopefully bring many of you into the conversation as well. I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction about WREN and about my journey as a leader of this organization and how it relates to WREN's journey. And then I have asked a few of the team members who are actively participating in WREN's anti-racist working group to share some of their key takeaways and learnings from this process thus far. Because this work is very personal, and I think it's important to hear from more than one perspective on how it's going within a single organization. And then we really would love to hear from you all. And we are excited to share, and we are always learning every single day. And there's a lot to share. And so we are going to try and focus on some of the more important context and background that I think is relevant to the discussion today. And then also focus on a few key steps that we've taken as an organization that are helping us move forward, because in my experience, it really helps to hear about the concrete things that organizations are trying. And the theme of this is moving from rhetoric to action. So trying to bring this down to what can we actually do as individuals and within our organizations to move towards dismantling white supremacy, being more actively anti-racist. So with that intro, I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about WREN. As Debbie said, we are a statewide organization. Our mission is to build a movement to advance the health, economic well-being, and rights of women, girls, and their families in South Carolina. And we're a relatively young organization. We launched less than 5 years ago. And we have been learning a lot along the way. And one of the things that I've learned during this journey is we started off by saying that WREN is a strong collective voice for women, girls, and their families in South Carolina, with full intent of being very inclusive, and how that would include everyone in our state who identifies as a woman or a girl. But what I learned from feedback is that if you have an organization where the leadership is primarily white, cisgender, straight, then what you might be projecting is that who is the organization is serving as well. And that when we say all women, that we may not be living that in the way that we're doing the work. And just saying it isn't sufficient. That we couldn't and can't truly be a collective voice if we aren't being much more explicit and intentional and clear about how the work that we're doing affects and is shaped by people's diverse experiences. So it's race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, citizenship status, language, and how all of those and other factors intersect with gender to mean that different people have different experiences in the state, different barriers to being heard, and having their priorities lifted up. And that, in fact, we work a lot at the State House, and breaking news, the State House is dominated by white men. And that is the power structure that we work within and seek to influence. And that if we are seeking to change power, which we are, we can't do that in a way that is race neutral, or that is neutral to ethnicity and that and people's gender identity. That if we are approaching that work and putting forward people like me, people who have privilege because of my background, my identity as a white middle-class privileged person, then we may not be shifting power at all. We may be reinforcing some of the same inequities that have pervaded and held us back from progress as a state for years and generations. So that was a realization that came to me and to us, over time. And we talked about these issues internally pretty early on, and we got feedback from some trusted partners who said, you're not actually as inclusive or doing as well as you probably think that you are in your external programming. But it has taken time and is still taking time, and we're still on this journey to address these limitations more intentionally, and to be more explicit. In 2017, we co-founded with 3 other partners in the Southeast region, and partners in Georgia and Tennessee, a coalition called the Southeastern Alliance for Reproductive Equity. It's a multiracial alliance with partners in the reproductive health rights and justice space that had dismantling white supremacy as a core goal. And when we first were developing that work together and talking about it, I was really uncomfortable with that term. It took me some time to realize that that was part of the point, and that my comfort was not what needed to be privileged in that work, and that I needed to get much more comfortable being uncomfortable about addressing white supremacy, both my lived experience and the ways that I benefit from it, as well as how myself as a leader in our organization can perpetuate it, and how we need to be much more explicit about saying it, addressing it, dismantling it. As part of that alliance, we started doing some work looking at several different frameworks. One of them is the 6 phases of equity practice, and I'll put a link in there in a moment about that resource, but kind of placing the organization at where we are on an equity journey, and getting a lot more real about where WREN was at that time, and where we needed to get to. And so we were doing a lot of work in partnership with Coalition and internal work as an organization, but a lot of that was internal and behind the scenes, and we were not sharing much of it publicly. And there was still, I would say, from my perspective, some discomfort with that, sharing that publicly, admitting what we didn't know, avoid, getting trapped in this idea of perfectionism about we've got this figured out, and we'd rather be nice. I'd rather be nice and preserve comfort rather than rocking the boat and potentially making myself and other people uncomfortable. And so that has been something that has been a real growth trajectory for myself as a leader of an organization and within this broader movement. And we realized last year, after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others, that these were not new incidents, of course, but they were elevated in our popular consciousness, and the urgency of the situation became, much more clear. And like all of you, like many of us in this broader community, we knew that we couldn't afford to be polite and careful about dealing with the issues of white supremacy and racism that are killing our Black and Brown community members and colleagues and friends and partners. And we just can't afford to do that. So that's when we got more explicit about sharing our commitment and defining our commitment, really. And we made a statement, like many other organizations, last June, I think it was, about our commitment. And we got feedback on that statement, like many of you, I'm sure, did if you made a statement. Some of it was dismissive and, why is WREN focusing on this? Like, this is I don't want to hear this. Take me off your listserv, basically. And then some of it was, yeah, this sounds really good, but you know what? You haven't necessarily been living this in your actions. And how do you intend to truly change as an organization? And that was the feedback that we really took seriously, because that was being called out or called in by people who were really serious, taking our message seriously, but challenging us and saying, this has got to be more than, is it more than a statement? So we knew that we needed and still need to do more to move from this rhetoric into action. And I, again, just want to mention a few ways that we have done that. And none of these are sufficient towards, transforming your organization, but they are some of the things that that can be helpful. So first of all, we were working on a strategic planning process last summer, and we took the time to be much more direct about soliciting feedback from stakeholders about how we've been doing in regards to equity inclusion, and really incorporating that feedback into our strategic plan and having some difficult conversations about the feedback that we were getting from different groups, and again, taking that really seriously. We also had updated, one of the things I think is really important is to look at your internal policies and to make sure that you're living your values. We advocate all the time on issues of pay equity, for example, and we needed to make sure that our internal policies and practices were meeting what we were advocating for in the community. So a couple of specific examples of how we've moved this work over time is, one, whenever we put out a job description, we always put the salary range in it, and we never ask for salary history, because asking for salary history can perpetuate discrimination that has existed over generations and can artificially set somebody's salary at a level that was never fair in the first place. So we never ask salary history, and also to increase transparency during the recruiting and hiring process, we always provide the salary range so that folks are more aware of where that discussion and negotiation is starting from. It also saves time. It's we've all probably been in the position where we've gotten to the final stage of an interview process on either end and heard a number and been surprised by it. And at that point, a lot of time has been wasted. And again, you may have introduced a lot of bias into that situation that can be avoided upfront by being clear about salary ranges. We also defined our own pay equity statement and a compensation strategy that is derived from that makes it clear about what factors that we use to determine and setting compensation, and changing that over time, providing raises or promotions, and making it explicit about what those decisions are based on. So again, to try and remove from the purely subjective and often the practices that often will privilege people who are more similar to the person making the decision, So, and into something that is more objective and clear and transparent to everybody involved. And I want to shout out Willis HR Group, that was our HR partner and helping us with that compensation strategy framework. They were tremendously helpful, and I would recommend them to any of you. We also, as I mentioned at the beginning, established an anti-racist working group about a year ago. Well, I guess no, it was about 9 months ago. And this is comprised of both board and staff members. And it was on a volunteer basis, but we have a great mix of different racial identity, different roles within the organization. And we have a monthly meeting, 2 hours, where we really spend time digging into these issues, setting strategy, coming up with a training agenda for our board. Beth Ruffin, who is the vice chair of our board, provided a great training to the entire board and staff on implicit bias. And then we've had a series of trainings open to both staff and board. And I've got to shout out Melissa Moore, who's on the call. Melissa is our Low Country manager and really took the lead in developing a training series for, there they are. Hey, Melissa. A training series that has been super helpful for our staff and looking at some of these intersecting identities and how we can move into better practice and in terms of how we work with partners. So I want to make sure y'all know who these partners are and can think about calling on them for their expertise. Able South Carolina has provided a training for us on disability justice and inclusion and how to make our work more inclusive of people with disabilities. Gender Benders provided an awesome training on trans inclusivity. And Every Black Girl Inc. Provided a really great training on how to be a better ally to Black girls, and also a more general discussion about how to address power imbalances in the work that we do. And then the Charleston Immigrant Coalition had a great training on immigrant justice and how it intersects with reproductive justice, which is one of our focus areas, reproductive justice is. And so having that discussion about immigrant justice and reproductive justice and how they intersect was really powerful. And all of these have been trainings, but they have also been explorations of how we can work together more effectively going forward. And then finally, we have the practice of compensating those people who were asking to train us and people we're bringing in as speakers, so that we're not asking people to provide free labor just because they're a partner or a friend. We value people's expertise and their labor, and we want to compensate them for it. So that's another practice that we have been, we were sort of doing it sporadically before, but we are much more intentional about that and consistent about that. So those are just a few of the examples of some of the steps that we've taken to move us from rhetoric into action. We have a long way to go, but these have been some helpful steps. I want to transition to give space to some of my other colleagues to talk about their experience in this work. Because again, this work is personal. Everybody has a different starting point and a different perspective on it. And I think it's really helpful to hear from others about how they've experienced the work. So I'm going to give a very general prompt to my colleagues. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves to you and to then share what is one of the shifts, significant shifts that either you have been through experiencing this work and or have seen the organization shift over the last year or so. And then would love for all of you, as you're listening to this reflection, please feel free to jump in the chat and tell us some of the shifts that you've experienced as you've been engaging in anti-racist work. And we will hopefully be able to unmute and hear from some of you. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley Lidow and ask her to share. Over to you, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. My name is Ashley Lidow. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy and Government Relations for the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network. I've been with WREN since we became an organization, so I've been, along with Anne and our other colleague, Brandy Ellison, there from the start. And just the reflection I wanted to raise in this space is actually something I brought up in our last anti-racist working group call. That we had when we were discussing this is really, I have transformed as myself. So speaking from myself, of coming from a place of thinking that I knew everything, I could read everything, I got it, I'm good to go. A lot of thinking you say the right things and you're ready to roll. Like, of course I get it. I'm there with it, woke, as you would say, and then you aren't doing the action steps. So along with a lot of this work, I have also felt myself learning that I am wrong in a lot of times. I need to be quiet a lot more. I need to listen a lot more and be okay with the uncomfortable nature of being a person who's actively anti-racist, uncomfortable in my personal life where I actually challenge my family members when they say things that are racist or sexist or ableist, uncomfortable in spaces that we create. And when I say uncomfortable, I'm meaning I need to step up if there is some comment that is made, if there is something that's making the space harmful, I have an obligation to saying something, and saying something for myself was a place of discomfort. And then also learning that when partners are correcting or teaching or providing feedback, that's a real gift. It's a real big gift that they're giving to me. They do not have to do that. And that if I'm uncomfortable receiving that gift, I really need to actually sit with myself and think a lot more about what I'm doing, about how I'm centering myself, and going from that kind of arrogance and know-it-all space into that you really need a lot to learn more. You didn't know a lot going through school. Your family didn't center the right things in some of the teachings that you learned. It's something that is transformative and shows that we all have work to do. So I actively every day have to be anti-racist and not just say that I'm anti-racist. I have to do it. And if I see something that makes me uncomfortable, I have to do something about it rather than just walking away. And one of the things that makes it, as a employee of an organization who says that they want to be anti-racist, we did say a lot of the things that you're supposed to say, and we raised up statistics and all those things, but this transition, I could feel it as a staff member where I felt more comfortable actually raising my voice in spaces when I could see that Anne was starting to actually externally say and do the things. So from a staff perspective, I felt much more able and willing to take the steps that I needed to take forward externally to challenge partners, to challenge legislators, to challenge those who might have power when I saw that Anne was willing to do so, because she's always been there for us as staff and said, I have your back. And she always has had my back in situations, but it's very different as a staff person in that power dynamic to go from like, yeah, Anne says she has my back, but like, if I'm going to tell a legislator, like, no, you can't speak to our testifier that way. No, you can't do this. No, I'm taking a stand. Like, the difference of seeing that Anne is actually going to be the one who says, actually, that is an inappropriate thing to say. Actually, that's inappropriate. And then also, since Janet's on the call, Janet is our former board chair of WREN and now still sits on our board. And I have actively seen Janet speak out against things that are going on in the community. And that also is something that I'll raise up as somebody in a power dynamic situation, watching the leaders of our org starting to take the steps. I definitely felt like I could, as a WREN staff member, take more steps that I know needed to be taken, but I definitely hesitated, which I also am learning and growing of. If I really want to be the person who is anti-racist, I need to actively just be that person. So that's what I wanted to share with the group. And Anne, are we going alphabetical? Does that make Courtney next? All right, Courtney.
Great. Thank you, and Ashley. So I will, I think my shift is going to focus on feedback. So within the narrative that Anne shared, if you'll notice, there were several highlight points or key points where she talked about taking feedback and learning from it. So I want to emphasize some of those moments, but also just a question for the chat box after I'm through. So throughout my time at WREN, I've always been involved in programming in some kind of way. So whether it was in my first role in the Greenville-Spartanburg area, or now when I'm here as Director of Communications, there's always been some kind of event aspect to my roles. So with that in mind, we always survey people and we always ask for feedback. And I've noticed that as we've been willing to be more transparent about who we're trying to become, the feedback gets more honest, right? So if there are any other event folks out there, I'm sure you've seen surveys with 5 stars, great event, but also mixed in with that, there are some people who are willing to give grace, but also give critical feedback. I was just going through some of my files not too long ago, and we have note cards from my very first summit in 2018. And yes, to those of you who have been to the WREN Summit, there are note cards that say, this session on pay equity was great, but I wish you'd talk about the way race is involved as well. So we've consistently heard from people that the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network should also understand how different identities and different oppressions intersect to form a person's lived identity. And that's something that we've evolved on to date. But I do want to give some major props to Melissa, because they had an opportunity to receive feedback in person and respond in the moment in a way that I don't think I would have been equipped to do at that time. That was my first event as Director of Communications. This was December 2019, right? And at the Low Country Forum, there were some Latinx folks in the audience who spoke up and said, great programming, but where was I in it? That's kind of a dilution of the points they were making. But Melissa was like, you're absolutely right. Here is the microphone. And that kind of vulnerability and quick thinking is what laid the groundwork for our relationships that we have now. So when you are, the big org in the room, it can be kind of scary for individuals to say, oh, you kind of missed the mark on this. But when people are willing to put themselves out there, they're doing it for a really valid reason. That reason to me is that they think your work is worthwhile, because I'm not a person who wastes my time. So if I'm critiquing something, it's because I think it can be better. So the grace that we've received from our community is because they believe we can be better and do better. And I think that is a compliment, but it's also a responsibility that we now hold. I also think that a lot of the grace we receive as an organization is because both Anne and our board have made some great hiring decisions. Like not to be too on the nose about it, but I think people take notice when you surround yourself with people who reflect their identities and community, but also when those people are put into decision-making positions, because there are many organizations in both the business and nonprofit sectors who have people of color in their organization, but they are not making decisions. So people are aware, people notice, people know what your staff and board looks like, even if it's not on a website, people talk, right? And that takes me to another finer point on feedback. Not everyone in your organization will receive the same feedback or be privy to, I guess, the level of honesty. So at this moment, all of you, there are queer folks and people of color in your organization who are hearing different things from community than you are. And I think it's important that we create spaces within our organizations to allow for that fact, because I'm not a director of communications. I'm a Black director of communications. So when something goes wrong, I'm held accountable both by our network, our staff, our board, but also all of Blackness. And that is a responsibility and burden that is unique to people who hold multiple identities. So it is a true privilege to be able to exist in your role as just a person. But for your staff members of color and for the queer folks on your staff, they are beholden to more than just you. So I think it's important, and something that we've really done with our anti-racist working group, for example, we have allowed people to like pull in and out based on their identities. And I think that's why it was important that this group was voluntary, because a mistake you can make is choosing the people of color and saying, fix white supremacy. And that's not something that should be happening. I think that is where I'll end it, but I think it's important to take feedback however it comes, and know when and how to respond. And if you get your response wrong, that is okay. That's okay too. With that, I will toss it to, I don't know who's next from our staff.
Kayla, you good?
I think it's me. Hi, so my name is Kayla Mallett. I am, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the network engagement manager at WREN. I've been on staff the shortest in our on our team. So for just a little over a year now, I've been a team member at WREN, but have been a supporter of WREN since WREN became WREN, and have admired the work from afar and in various other aspects of engaging the work at WREN prior to becoming a team member. And then now obviously getting to see the work that's happening up close and personal as a member of the team. I think the biggest shift to me that I'd like to kind of speak to is really closely related to the work that I get to do as network engagement manager. Shortly after coming in, I began to do a series of like one-on-one conversations with people in our network. And that if you're in our network, that's you get the emails, you follow us on social media, you've come to an event. So there's a lot of folks in our network, and there's a lot of ways to engage our network. But one of the things that kind of came up in having those conversations is just kind of where power rests within the WREN network. And so if you think about it, we have a staff of about 9 people. We have a network of 45,000 people. For a lot of folks that I spoke to, and I'd say, you know, what's your experience as a member of the network been like? And they'd go like, oh, I'm in the network. I didn't know I was in the network because although they'd been in communication and they get the emails and they're on social media, they weren't necessarily clear that they were a part of the network. And for some folks, it kind of looks like, oh, there's the WREN staff And that's the network. And then they communicate to all of us. And then there's, some special way that you get into the network, and there's special access. And I think Ann kind of talked about and alluded to the fact that to some people, based on the composition of our staff, there are kind of assumptions made about who's in the network and what that means to be in the network and what the requirements are to be in the network. So one of the conversations that we started having and then built into our strategic plan and have since been moving forward with is, how do we decentralize power in our network, right? And it's for the purpose of making us stronger, but also so that we actually reflect the intersections, that the decision-making, that the input, that the knowledge base in our network actually reflect the intersections that we claim to hold space for. And so in doing that, we've been really intentional about leaning into the expertise and wisdom and lived experience of folks in our network. I think Ann mentioned, even paying folks for their labor, not taking for granted that they have that expertise. Working towards an advocacy team leader model, which would acknowledge people as experts in their communities, whether that be geographical or identity-based or whatever have you, acknowledging them as experts in the community, and then asking how we can support them with tools for advocacy. So they feel stronger in advocacy, in engaging WREN's work, but also engaging the issues that are important to them, and not just seeing it as like, oh, now we have extra hands, but now we have extra accountability, right? So having people in the community who identify as advocacy team leaders, who are familiar with our work because we're being transparent about our work, and who have the tools, can also say, hey, WREN, this is who you claim to be. This is what I'm hearing in the community. These are our experiences. Here are the things we expect from you. Here are, ways that you can address these experiences. And so it empowers, it enables us to be able to expand our reach, especially as we start to think more about how do we move outside of just like Greenville, Charleston, and Columbia. It empowers us to be able to expand our reach, but to do so in a way where folks feel like they aren't just like, we're calling them to take action really quick, but they don't necessarily have actual say in the network, and that we're bringing more folks into the fold than were previously into the fold. And so that's why I think, especially the anti-racist working group work that we're doing, and the conversations that we're having, and the trainings that Melissa has offered to us and has brought to us are so important in the way that we do that work, because it helps us to hold space in a way that's not harmful and doesn't just exploit labor or experiences for our personal gain or for our advancement. And I think we've seen the impact of that even when you start to think about some of the organizing work that Melissa has led around the S1, the piece of legislation, the abortion ban, and the way folks have responded, the way that community was really leaned into for their expertise, the way the conversations were generative and not just like, hey, as a staff, we decided to do X, Y, and Z, now, come join us. It's very much so let's get together, let's kind of push back. There's a natural sense of urgency because it was urgent. But then there's also like, we get to like kind of fight back against that like nature of white supremacy too, and set the pace a little bit on how we do this. So like, let's take time and invite folks into the fold and hold them in a way that is responsible, that acknowledges that we're not well unless our network is well, which, we've also done in the way of trying to incorporate healing justice into our work. So bringing in breathwork practitioners, bringing in folks to lead mindful discussions after we've engaged people and after they've, given their labor, their volunteerism to our causes, like holding them in a way that says like, we don't just see you as a commodity or like as someone to give to us, but we want to actually make sure that this feels like a place that you belong, and that your work is honored, and that you're seen and supported. And so I think, to me, that's the biggest shift, just like moving and like actually seeing us. And it's not been a terribly long time. Like I said, I've been here a year, but to see us start to move in that way a little bit. And it hasn't, always been easy. Like I want to acknowledge that Courtney said it's great that we got to volunteer for the anti-racist working group. And I agree, as a Black woman who volunteered for that group, I agree. And it's awesome to be in those conversations and be in those discussions. Something that comes up sometimes though is also just the extra emotional labor for Black people in those kind of environments. So I think, if you're listening and you're thinking about how to maybe incorporate some of these practices, also consider what that extra emotional labor might look like for Black folks, because some of the things are, for Black folks, for people in the LGBTQ community, and other marginalized identities, because, some of the things that we talk about, sometimes, we're making decisions and we're like pondering this stuff and weighing options about issues that don't always feel optional to me as a Black woman, right? Like, don't always feel like something that you can kind of hang in the balance. And so it creates like an extra sense sometimes of an extra layer of considerations on not just the work that we do, but how I get to show up in those spaces. And so one of the things that I've appreciated about REN is like, I often opt to be silenced. I think in previous years, my inclination as a Black woman has been, if we're talking about race, I have to offer something, right? I have to offer a solution, or I have to have input. But it can be emotionally taxing sometimes. And sometimes like I opt for silence and listen, and trust that the people in the room will speak in honesty and integrity and not just be performative. And that's been, I think, for me in my years experience of working with REN, one of the things that has made this work feel a little easier, but also, at times, again, challenging, because there are things that still come into consideration that, I think, again, as a person, a Black person, a person with, various identities, it's no matter how we set the space up, I'm going to engage it differently. I'm going to show up differently than some of my counterparts. And so that's a consideration, but it's worth it because, again, ultimately we want to decentralize the power in the network so that we are moving in a way that holds space for folks of different identities, and that people feel like we're not just espousing our values, but that we are also living them. And so I think that's all I have. I hope it made sense and was clear. And maybe Maya next.
Thanks, Kayla. Hey all, my name is Maya Ward. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Communications and Development Associate for REN. And I have two kind of points on this. First, I feel as if my personal growth has kind of mirrored with REN's growth over in this topic over the past year. We've heard a lot of talk, and I really appreciate like Courtney and Kayla about feedback and inclusion and all of that. And I remember when we first like put out our statement, I was nervous because I was like wondering what we were going to get back, and hearing we didn't expect when we sent out our statement of solidarity around the Black Lives Matter protests that we were going to get feedback. I was fully expecting, this is wrong, or someone being upset with us for going in that direction, but I wasn't expecting for us to have a network member actually call us in and say, hey, your statement of solidarity does not do enough. And I think that was really a big impetus for us to grow and go along this path as an organization. And the thing that really highlighted there was the idea of the fear. We were afraid of putting out, at least I was, putting out a really strong statement because we didn't want to, get negative feedback. We didn't want to get alienation of some of our network members. And that's something I see as being pretty prevalent among a lot of nonprofits when it comes to making bold statements. But you don't want to lose a donor. You don't want to lose a supporter because you say something that they won't agree with. But you have to understand that if you're trying to be an organization that is inclusive of all, an organization that stands for, specifically REN, the rights of all people in South Carolina, you can't have messaging that excludes people from South Carolina. And so you can't be afraid to lose a donor or a supporter. Or I monitor REN's info box. I get responses to our emails. I look at all of our DMs and comments on social media. I see it. I see when people say, well, why are y'all focusing on this? And this is wrong. And you shouldn't be, you're for women, you shouldn't be focusing on this. But the idea is maybe we anger one or two people, but we are a movement that is for everyone. And if our messaging isn't reflective of the fact that we're standing for every single person in our state, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their skin color, then we're not actually doing our jobs being a network that stands up for everyone in the state. And one of the ideas that we talked about, because we had a long discussion about this topic prior to our actual presentation, is the idea that we can't bend to fit everyone in our organization. And that can be uncomfortable, especially if I'm speaking just as a woman. It can be uncomfortable to disappoint people or to upset people, but we have to be okay with that, because if we're not, then we risk not actually doing what we say we're doing when we say we are a movement that's representing people, a movement that's advancing people's rights. And so the idea that we can't bend to fit everyone, we have to stay firm in what we mean as an organization and what we stand for. And that's uncomfortable. And that's something that we definitely have to learn to grow with. It's something I personally have learned to grow with. I have to be firmer and standing up when I see injustice, or standing up when I see someone saying something inappropriate, even if I'm afraid that maybe I'll lose a friendship or maybe I'll make someone uncomfortable. Well, maybe they need to be uncomfortable in that moment, because maybe what they're doing, maybe it's making you uncomfortable, or we might laugh it off, but you don't think of all the other people out there who are hearing that and seeing you not doing anything about it, and realizing that maybe they can't turn to you for support. Maybe they can't look to you for guidance. And that's, me personally and me as an organization. And then two, I think one thing to point out is the anti-racist working group, sorry, y'all. It relies on a horizontal structure, which is something that a lot of people in the group have been kind of not uncomfortable with, but have seen as kind of eye-opening. There's no one facilitator, there's no one note taker. It rotates every single meeting. So each time there's a meeting, one new person is leading the group. And as a young person of color, I've been in spaces where it's hard for me to feel confident speaking up. It's hard for me to express my opinion, because I don't feel like I have the experience, or I, am the authority in the room, or anything like that. And so having a group where I can contribute, where there are clear guidelines that there is no one person who is in charge, there's no one person who has the ultimate authority in this space, it makes it so that I'm comfortable speaking and comfortable contributing. And I think REN tries to do that in general, but especially in this group where we are asking people to volunteer, to sometimes be put in situations where they're not necessarily on the most solid footing when it comes to, issues of race or gender or anything like that. And so that's something I would express as being really beneficial to this work, is the idea that we have purposefully in our work, which is making us uncomfortable, put ourselves in a further uncomfortable position by creating a space that allows the amplification of voices that often aren't. And so that's, what I'd close with is, even if it makes you uncomfortable, understand that if you have a mission that is inclusivity, if you have a mission that is defending rights, if you have a mission that is honestly just trying to help people, you have to be willing to not bend in that, even if it means that you might, make some people uncomfortable. Anyways, I think next would be Melissa.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything that my colleagues have said. I'm going to start by speaking from my own personal transformation. So if you're doing the work, you're not going to feel good about yourself, because it's not a feel good kind of thing. And sometimes we think doing the right thing, we do it because it makes us feel good. In this case, this is a lot of vulnerability and self-reflection, and white supremacy has its tentacles in everything. It is the most sustainable freaking thing, it seeps into everything. And honestly, you're going to be a recovering from white supremacy all your life when you start down this path. So you're gonna mess up. There are no cookies, there are no pats on the back, so just resign yourself to that. And then when you're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, if a bunch of white people are really happy about those trainings and feel great and comfortable about those trainings, chances are it's not going deep enough. You're gonna need something that is gonna make you feel defensive. It's gonna bring out some real negative feelings. You're gonna be like, no, that's not right, no. So think about looking for the trainings that don't necessarily make white people feel good and comfortable. Self-critique is very important, and self-reflection. So one thing for me is that everything I do, I have to stop sometimes and slow myself down to think, okay, check in. Am I perpetuating systems of white supremacy? Let me just look at what I've done here. And sometimes it's not always obvious. Sometimes you're going to need to stop and check in if you feel like you've done something. Check in with the people who might be most impacted, but not in a burdensome way. And I can't even explain to you how to do that. Not putting emotional labor on other people to tell you when you've messed up. So don't always expect people who hold marginalization that you don't to always tell you that you messed up. You have to be willing to constantly look at yourself and examine yourself and be insecure, be self-conscious about it. I know we're all taught to pretend, fake it till you make it, but you can't do that in this case. I love what you said about taking risks and being willing to lose people. When you're being transformative and not performative, so many of us understand, like some of these diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings give you the right language to use to make yourself sound like you're doing all the right things and checking the boxes, whereas you're not experiencing transformation. Transformation, just like exercise, is so good for you, but it's painful. Growth is painful. So if you're being transformative and not performative, you have to be willing to use your privilege, take risks, being willing to lose people, and preference the people who experience more marginalization over the privileged people. So that means donors sometimes, like the people who have all the money and the power, the systemic power. They're not always the ones doing the right thing. And if they're not, you got to be willing to lose them because people don't take critical feedback very well often. So they'll lash out against you sometimes and think that, you're attacking me if you're giving them critical feedback. And if they can't accept critical feedback as a gift, then sometimes they're going to need to go do some work before they can be in relationship with you. Making yourself vulnerable, always very important. And before you can even do it in your organizations or externally, you have to do it inside yourself. You got to fix you before you can do anything external. Oh my God, was I on mute this whole time? Oh, thank God.
Oh, you are so amazing. You're so amazing.
Okay.
1 second.
For some reason, I just saw I was on mute. So WREN has done a good job, I think, in sort of shifting our perspective to not overvalue coercive systems of power like these seats that the legislators hold, but also understanding that, these systems of power are rooted in white supremacy and oppression. We value our grassroots community that is rooted in community rather than rooted in these systems of power. So that means also shifting away from the professionalization of everything and leaning into people with a lot of letters behind their names as content matter experts. People who are most impacted by bad policy are content matter experts as well, and they don't need to have like a whole bunch of letters behind their names to sit on panels and be paid for their expertise. They're just as much experts as the lawyers and the doctors. So I've been seeing us shift more towards that. The gender justice policy agenda, I saw someone post in the chat about Kimberly Crenshaw's Intersectionality Matters. Well, our policy agenda has shifted away from just women's rights focus to a more intersectional gender justice focus, which takes into account people's sexual orientation, gender identities, immigration status, understanding that there are many intersecting oppressions, and gender justice is the goal here, not just women's rights, because women will never succeed until gender-based oppression is eliminated. That is, gender-based oppression is a part of white supremacy. And I think really kind of giving yourself the time to build relationships, not exploitationships, which are like, get on this video on our website so that we look diverse, or colonization ships, which is like, let me move into these spaces that aren't really in my lane, but I'm going to colonize this work that is actually being better done by grassroots, BIPOC leaders. So making sure that you're actually building authentic relationships, not colonizing spaces or exploiting people, very important. That's pretty much it. So, yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you, team. Thank you all so much. I know we're at time and folks need to go. So we would love to hear more from you. Please reach out to us. I'll share my email address and happy to put you in touch with any of my other amazing colleagues who spoke today. And we hope to keep working with you to both shift power, because that's what we're all trying to do. And we're trying to balances in our work as nonprofit leaders, and also to trust the people we work with, our community members, our staff, and ourselves, that we can transform, that we will be okay, we can lean into each other, and that there's so much more to be gained by experiencing that discomfort and moving forward than there is by standing still and continuing to live in a world that is not equitable or free for everybody. So thank you Together SC so much. Thank you all of you, and let's keep working together.
Thank you so much, Anne, and your team. What an amazing team. Courtney, Ashley, Kayla, Maya, and Melissa. Wow, this was just extremely powerful. I wish we had more time, and I think we need to digest what we heard today and engage you in more conversations, because this was truly, it was very a wonderful conversation. And Melissa, you certainly are the wordsmith. I captured so much. If we just go out with transformative, not performative, if I can even say it, I think if I take that away from my day, I think I've made a successful day. So I thank all of you for being here, and we thank WREN for hosting this session. And we look forward to seeing all of our Together SC allies on our next call. Be on the lookout for other upcoming calls. And next month on April 1st, in this same space, Removing Our Blinders, we will hear from Mayor Bill Barnett about his experience as a white male, small town, I guess Spartanburg's not that small town, but city leader, and his experience with racism and white privilege and white supremacy. So thank you all. I hope you all have a great day. Enjoy it. And thank you to the team at WREN.